Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, I wasn't going to originally look at this video, I didn't have it planned, but I saw it and just had to bring it to your attention. It's going to be the Beatles again in 1965, but this video is of a show that's 1 hour 34 in length. I'm going to put the link to this in the description below so you guys can check out the whole show if you want to, but there are so many acts just literally one on, one off, just revolving the whole time. We've got the Animals in there, we've got Bo Diddley in there, we've got the Kinks in there somewhere. I've also seen a little bit of footage of the Rolling Stones in here as well. So many acts, you can check it out. But the Beatles as well, they come on and play. We're going to look at their cover of Long Tall Sally just because I wanted to show you guys this, because it is such a great cover of a really difficult track to cover in the first place. But let's get the guys up on screen and see how they get on. And there we have it. What a performance that was, considering that we don't have any harmony vocals here, which you would say is the strong suit of the Beatles in terms of getting that full sound and the way that they could have three harmonies just working with each other. Here it's just all out from a great vocal. It's just unbelievable by Paul. Just that one voice by itself at the front of the stage. And another thing that I want to point out about Paul and the way that he sings, but more importantly, the way that he plays bass. Because especially when you're watching a video like this and we get that tight shot just of his face, you forget that sometimes you forget altogether that he's playing bass, that he's playing runs, that he's so solid all the time with Ringo. And he's putting in so much expression into the vocal, but also into the performance. Another thing that I did say about Paul in the other video that I did in 1963, a couple of years before this, is that he would look at the camera, and even in this venue, have a look at the size of venue here. He still knows where the camera is to look at it. And that's just amazing to have researched it to find where it is, because you'll see a few shots where he is looking into the camera, again, connecting with the audience behind the screen as well as in the venue at the time. And if you are going to watch this whole video, Ticket to Ride was performed just before this, and Ringo's drumming, I do mention this on the other video how unique he was, but just take Ticket to Ride as an example. The way that the drums flow in terms of having those toms in there, it is such a unique thing to do. And then he does go straight when we start to get more into the chorus of the track. Again, with the Beatles, it's hard to decipher where a verse is, where a chorus is, because it's so well put together. It's interesting the whole time. But the way that Ringo changes it up in that verse, it would sound totally different if you just put a straight beat to that. It would just sound so much more boring, just less interesting, but that's what Ringo could do. And I didn't mention in the last video the fact that Ringo is actually left-handed, but then he was taught to play right-handed. He didn't actually get taught to play, he just worked it out for himself, and that's just the kit that he was given, a right-handed kit. So it meant that when he was doing fills, he very much preferred fills that went from right to left, because he could lead with his left hand, because that's what he would have wanted to do as a drummer, rather than going from left to right, which is, of course, the standard way you would play that right-handed kit. And that is one of those things, again, it's going to make his drumming sound unique because of that preference. And another thing that I love about this performance is the way that Ringo is getting into it at the end. I always say about the best bands is that they push their performance to the limit, and when bands play with emotion, like the Beatles do here and throughout their live performances, that connects with an audience. Of course, most of the time the audience can hear much because they're screaming double the volume of the band. I have got a little bit of misleading camera work here, which tends to be the case in most live music videos, because we're looking at George when John's actually playing the lead guitar in that first section, whereas George is just playing the rhythm. And then when it does go to George's solo, we're looking at Paul for a little bit, but then it does get into looking at George just for a little bit, that last solo that we hear. And in terms of analysing the guitar playing, the Beatles were the prime example of not needing to be technically amazing to get down a solo that's going to suit the song and just going to really fit in there into a composition, because that's what the Beatles were all about, writing a composition that is just going to be one great song, rather than having little bits in there that might not suit. They would never do that. And it's a classic rock and roll lead here. George does a great job on this, as well as John, in terms of getting it just to suit the track. It doesn't have to be a million notes a second, as long as you just stick to your shapes and keep it in key and get a little bit of expression in there as well, like George does with those bends. And it was always a case with the Beatles, they've never let you down in any department. Of course, people aren't expecting George to melt your face and start shredding, because it's not the Beatles, that's not the point. The other Beatles video that I did when they're recording it in a studio, a live performance on a Swedish TV show, that was really well organised and there weren't any crazy fans there. It was just quite reserved, quite an intimate gig. So in 1964, they then had their movie, A Hard Day's Night, that came out, and Beatlemania was in full flow by this time, 1965. And if you do watch this whole video, you'll be able to see some of the crowd going absolutely mental. 1965 was a huge year for the Beatles with their live performance, because they had their stand-out gig and really stand-alone gig that was in New York at the stadium that you would have seen the footage from. If you weren't there yourself, you certainly would know about it. But the reason that that was such an important event was because it was done on such a scale. It hadn't been done before, and the Beatles had 4 175-watt speakers for the PA, so in terms of the vocals coming out into the crowd. But you can imagine that with a stadium full of screaming women, this didn't cut it at all, to the point where the screaming of the crowd was double the volume of what was coming from the stage. So you just wouldn't be able to hear anything that was going on. And this was a real turning point at the time, because it now showed clearly that the technology they had wasn't fit for purpose, because it just wasn't loud enough. So people had to go away and develop something that meant you could go to a show in a stadium and now hear what is actually going on stage. But certainly what you'll find with a lot of these performances, as you will hear in this performance, is that the PA is being pushed to the limit, so therefore you get the distortion through the microphone on the vocal. And sometimes, especially when somebody's singing with attitude, it can really add something to the performance, but it's because of the volume of the PA is just whopped up to maximum, just whopped up to 11, and that causes the distortion. So this is what actually led to the Beatles performing in 1966, but then having 4 years until 1970 where they were just in the studio. They didn't want to play live anymore. They literally couldn't get their sound out there because of the screaming coming from the crowd. It was louder than what they were playing. And as a musician and as an artist, that would have been so frustrating that you want to put on a great show, you want to be heard, but then you literally can't be heard by most of the crowd. Only the people right in front of the stage will be able to hear what's going on. Just to put a spotlight on Paul's vocals here again, because the way that he's leaning into the sound here, just belting it out the whole time, is so impressive. I would love to see a modern day boy band trying to take on this track, and by the way, play all the instruments to it as well, because this really is a standalone performance, because this isn't some light-hearted pop version of a great original track. It's a great cover of a track that is notoriously hard to do. We've got a G5 in there. When you just analyze that, and most people are always focusing on that high C, the C5, but the way that Paul gets up to that G5 is just insane, considering he's got that same quality to his vocal throughout his range. It doesn't sound like that top G is separated from the rest of his range. So it is an absolutely stellar performance vocally, and when you factor in that he's playing bass, but also looking at the crowd, looking at the camera that is filming the performance, it is just on a different level. One thing that the Beatles would have certainly done is practice on the road. They were actually just gigging so much that it's the best way to rehearse is actually playing live to people, because it really does make you learn so much more quickly than if you're just in a rehearsal studio, because you can say, oh, well, we messed up that, so we'll start again from the beginning. You don't get that option on the road and playing live. The Beatles certainly did master their craft in those 2 and 3 years that they were gigging in and around Liverpool and over in Hamburg as well, just absolutely getting it down to a T, because they would have learned so much so quickly under those circumstances. But for me, the Beatles, with their live performances, they were just in a different league to other bands that were around at the time, in the sense that other bands would have been doing something very well. They had their own particular sound, their own particular genre, and they were very good at that. Whereas the Beatles, this is evidence enough that they can manipulate their sound so that they are so versatile. They can pull off a cover like this that would be so difficult to do if you were just genuinely a pop band, because this really has some heavy rock and roll influences in there, almost like a classic rock vocal we get here. This is one of those videos that I just had to get up on screen because it's a great indication of the strengths that the Beatles had in areas that you might not necessarily think they have that ability to go to that particular place with a particular track. And Long Tall Sally is especially a great example of Paul's vocal ability. But thank you so much for watching this video. This is one of those that I just had to get up on screen because I thought it was a great cover of what I think is a notoriously difficult track to do half decently live. But keep your suggestions coming in the comments below and let me know what you guys think. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one.